My brother's voice cut through the silence at 3:47 a.m. Mom's funeral is Thursday. Family only. You're not welcome, Emma. You've embarrassed us enough. He hung up before I could respond. Before I could tell him that while he thought I was a quote-quote failed washout living off the government, I was actually Admiral Emma Miller, commanding officer of the Navy's most elite counter-terrorism unit. Before I could explain that the shame he spoke of was actually the highest security clearance in the military. They banned their own daughter from her mother's funeral, thinking I was nothing. They had no idea that in 72 hours, 8 Navy SEALs would stand at attention in that same funeral home, rendering a salute that would shatter everything my family thought they knew about their disappointing youngest child. I sat there in my quarters aboard the USS Leviathan, still holding the phone, the classified mission reports scattered across my desk, suddenly feeling insignificant compared to the weight of my brother's words. The blue glow of the secure communication terminal cast shadows across the walls lined with commendations my family had never seen. Navy Cross, Purple Heart, Defense Distinguished Service Medal. Each one representing moments when I'd chosen duty over family explanations, classified operations over Christmas dinners, national security over personal relationships. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, trusted with the lives of hundreds of sailors, responsible for missions that would never make the headlines but kept America safe while we slept. Yet to my own flesh and blood, I was Emma the disappointment. Emma who couldn't hack it in the real world. Emma who joined the military because she couldn't figure out what to do with her life. I walked to the porthole and stared out at the dark Pacific waters. Somewhere out there, my mother was lying in a funeral home in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, surrounded by flowers and sympathy cards from a community that had no idea her youngest daughter was currently 3,000 miles away, commanding a nuclear-powered vessel worth more than their entire town's annual budget. The cruel part was that I understood their perspective. The last time my family had seen me, I was 21 years old, walking away from everything they'd planned for my life. The full-ride scholarship to Penn State that Uncle Marcus had helped secure. The internship at the family's accounting firm where I was supposed to follow in Dad's footsteps. The safe, predictable path that would have kept me close to home, close to their expectations, close to their approval. Instead, I'd chosen the unknown. I'd chosen the Navy. But not just any Navy career. Through a series of events that I could never fully explain to them, even if classification wasn't an issue, I'd been recruited into a program that didn't officially exist. A program that took promising young officers and molded them into something that operated in the shadows between diplomacy and warfare. The kind of work where success was measured not in headlines or promotions, but in the absence of catastrophe. Where the greatest victories were the disasters that never happened. The phone buzzed again. This time it was a text message from my sister-in-law, Sarah. At least she had the courtesy to add some fake sympathy to her rejection. Emma, I'm sorry about your mom, but you have to understand. This is a very difficult time for the family. Your father is devastated, and frankly, your lifestyle choices have always been hard for him to accept. Maybe it's better if you stay away. For everyone's sake, lifestyle choices. I almost laughed. If they only knew what my lifestyle choices actually entailed. While they saw me as the black sheep who'd abandoned the family business for what they assumed was some low-level military grunt work, the reality was that I spent my days coordinating with the Pentagon, briefing senators, and making decisions that could shift the geopolitical balance of entire regions. Just last month, I'd successfully prevented what could have been the largest terrorist attack on American soil since 9/11. The operation had required coordinating with 6 different intelligence agencies, deploying assets across 3 continents, and making split-second decisions that saved thousands of lives. The president himself had called to thank me personally, though even that conversation would remain classified for the next 30 years. But to my family, I was just Emma, who couldn't commit to anything, and ran away when things got tough. The messages had been coming for years, each one a small knife twist of disappointment wrapped in family concern. Birthday cards that arrived 3 weeks late, with notes about hoping I'd find my way eventually. Christmas calls where conversation dried up after the obligatory pleasantries because my work was classified and their lives felt increasingly foreign to me. Thanksgiving invitations that came with subtle suggestions that maybe I should consider a more stable career path. The distance had grown slowly, like continental drift. At first, I'd tried to bridge it. I'd taken leave when I could, shown up for graduations and anniversaries, always in civilian clothes with cover stories about my government desk job. But each visit had felt more strained, more artificial. They'd ask questions I couldn't answer, share gossip about neighbors I no longer knew, discuss business decisions in a world I'd left behind. My father, Harold Miller, had been particularly vocal about his disappointment. A third-generation CPA who'd built Miller and Associates into the most respected accounting firm in 3 counties, he'd always assumed I'd be the 4th generation. Harold Miller and daughter. He'd had the brass nameplate made when I was 16, keeping it in his desk drawer like a talisman of future success. When I'd announced my intention to join the Navy, he'd stared at me like I'd spoken in a foreign language. "You want to what?" he'd asked, his voice carrying the particular tone reserved for completely incomprehensible statements. "Serve my country," I'd replied, using the most palatable explanation I could offer. "You can serve your country by paying taxes and being a productive citizen," he'd shot back. "This military thing is just running away from responsibility." The argument that followed had been epic in its futility. He'd thrown around words like wasted potential and selfish impulses. I'd countered with concepts like duty and honor that seemed to bounce off him like verbal tennis balls. My mother, God rest her soul, had tried to mediate, but the fundamental divide was too wide to bridge with well-intentioned compromises. They saw the military as what you did when you couldn't do anything else. A place for people who weren't smart enough for college or disciplined enough for business. The idea that someone with my grades, my opportunities, my advantages would choose military service over civilian success was simply incomprehensible to them. What made it worse was that I couldn't explain the real reason I'd stayed. The program that had recruited me wasn't something you could put on a resume or discuss at dinner parties. The work I did existed in classified reports and sealed briefings, in the margins of history where heroism was measured in prevented disasters rather than celebrated victories. I thought about my mother, lying in that funeral home, surrounded by people who thought her youngest daughter was a disappointment. Margaret Miller had always been the peacekeeper in our family, the one who tried to see everyone's perspective, who believed that love could overcome any disagreement given enough time and patience. She'd been the one who'd suggested the compromise that became our family's standard operating procedure. Don't ask too many questions about Emma's work, and Emma won't push too hard about why she can't share details. It was an uneasy truce that had allowed us to maintain the pretense of normal family relationships for a few years. But even Mom's diplomatic efforts couldn't overcome the fundamental disconnect. When I'd miss Christmas because of a deployment they couldn't know about, when I'd cancel visits because of operations they couldn't understand, when I'd show up exhausted from missions they couldn't imagine, the gaps in our conversation grew wider. The last time I'd seen her was 18 months ago, when I'd managed to get emergency leave during a brief window between operations. She'd been in the hospital then, recovering from what everyone thought was routine surgery. The cancer diagnosis wouldn't come for another 6 months. I'd sat beside her bed, holding her hand, wanting desperately to tell her about the mission I'd just completed. A hostage rescue in Somalia that had saved 14 aid workers, including 3 Americans. The kind of operation that would never make the news but represented everything I'd joined the Navy to accomplish. Instead, we'd talked about safe topics. Her garden. The weather. Sarah's latest pregnancy. The conversation had felt hollow, filled with all the things we couldn't say rather than the things we could. "I know you're doing important work, sweetheart," she'd whispered as visiting hours ended. "I can see it in your eyes. I just wish." She'd trailed off, but I knew what she wished. She wished she could understand it. She wished she could share it. She wished it could bring us closer instead of driving us apart. Now she was gone, and the only family I had left had decided I wasn't worthy of saying goodbye. I pulled up the secure communication interface and started typing a message to my executive officer, Commander Rodriguez. As my second in command, he was one of the few people who knew the complete truth about my family situation, and more importantly, he was someone I trusted to handle the delicate operation I was about to propose. Request emergency leave authorization. Family crisis. Duration, 72 hours maximum. We'll maintain communication protocols. His response came back within minutes. Approved. Condolences on your loss, Admiral. Anything you need? I stared at the screen for a long moment before typing back. Actually, yes. I need a favor. How many of our team are currently stateside? The response made me smile for the first time since the phone call. 8 members of SEAL Team Bravo are at Norfolk. Were you thinking what I think you're thinking? I'll brief you in the morning. But Rodriguez, start making some calls. It's time my family learned who their disappointing daughter really is. The plan was audacious, probably inappropriate, and potentially career-ending if it went wrong. But as I looked at the photo on my desk, a picture of my mother and me from my high school graduation, both of us smiling, both of us believing the future held unlimited possibilities, I realized that some things were more important than protocol. My family thought they knew Emma Miller. They thought they knew her failures, her limitations, her disappointments. They'd made their judgment based on incomplete information and classification requirements they couldn't understand. But in 72 hours, they were going to meet Admiral Miller. And Admiral Miller didn't ask for permission. She took action. The next morning, I initiated the most complex operation of my career. Not against foreign adversaries or terrorist cells, but against the misconceptions of the people who were supposed to know me best. Phase 1. Intelligence gathering. Within hours, I knew everything about the funeral arrangements. Time, location, guest list, even the catering menu. When you have access to the kind of resources I had, civilian logistics become almost embarrassingly easy to penetrate. Phase 2. Asset deployment. 8 Navy SEALs, all volunteers from missions I'd commanded, all men who owed their lives to decisions I'd made in the field. When I explained what I needed, their responses were immediate and unanimous. When and where, Admiral? Quote, ... Phase 3, operational execution. This was the part that terrified me. Because once I walked into that funeral home in dress blues, once those 8 SEALs rendered their salute, there would be no going back. No more cover stories. No more family dinners where we pretended my work was ordinary. No more protecting them from the truth of who I'd become. But as I sat in my quarters, surrounded by the evidence of a life they'd never understood, I realized that protecting them from the truth had protected no one. It had only perpetuated a lie that was poison to all of us. My mother deserved better than to have died thinking her daughter was a disappointment. My family deserved to know that their judgment had been based on classification requirements, not character flaws. And maybe, just maybe, they deserved the chance to be proud of the woman they'd never really known. The phone rang again. This time it was my father. Emma. His voice was formal, distant. I assume Daniel told you about the arrangements. He did. A long pause. Your mother, at the end, she asked about you. I told her you were probably too busy with whatever it is you do. The knife twisted deeper. Dad, I know you think we don't understand your choices, Emma, but your mother and we just wanted you to have a stable life. A good life. The military. It's so uncertain. So dangerous. We worried that you were just drifting. If he only knew that I'd spent the last 3 years helping to chart the course of American foreign policy in some of the most volatile regions on Earth. I'm not drifting, Dad. Then what are you doing? Because we never see you. We never hear from you. And when we do, you can't tell us anything about your work, your life, your anything. It's like you're a stranger. For a moment, I considered breaking protocol right there. Telling him about the missions, the responsibilities, the reason for all those missed holidays and cryptic explanations. But the habits of operational security ran too deep. I'm serving my country, Dad, in ways I can't fully explain, but in ways that matter. He sighed. That's what you always say. But Emma, actions speak louder than words, and your actions have been pretty clear. You chose the military over your family. You chose secrecy over honesty. You chose distance over love. That's not. I have to go. The funeral director is here. Your mother's service is at 2 o'clock Thursday. Like Daniel said, it's family only. The line went dead. I stared at the phone, feeling the full weight of 4 years of misunderstanding crash down on me. They hadn't just banned me from the funeral. They'd excommunicated me from the family based on a fundamental misreading of who I was and what I'd chosen to do with my life. But in 48 hours, that was going to change. I opened my laptop and began typing the operational brief for what I'd privately codenamed Operation Family Truth. 8 Navy SEALs, 1 dress blue uniform, and a funeral that was about to become the most dramatic family reunion in Miller family history. My mother had always said that the truth had a way of coming out eventually. She'd just never imagined it would arrive wearing Admiral stars and escorted by the most elite fighting force in the world. But some truths are too important to whisper. Some truths demand to be announced with all the ceremony and honor they deserve. Thursday afternoon, my family was going to learn that their disappointing daughter had become something they'd never imagined possible. And for the first time in 4 years, they were going to understand exactly what serving my country actually meant. The only question now was whether they'd be proud of the truth, or whether they'd realize they'd been wrong about everything for so long that pride would be impossible. But that was a risk I was finally ready to take, because my mother deserved to be buried knowing that her youngest daughter hadn't failed at anything. She'd just succeeded in ways that were too classified to share until now. And now? Now it was time to declassify Admiral Emma Miller for the people who mattered most. The seeds of this estrangement were planted long before I ever set foot on a naval vessel. They took root in a living room in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, on a humid August evening in 2019, when I was 21 years old and thought I could explain the unexplainable to people who lived in a world where success was measured in quarterly reports and annual profit margins. The Navy? My father's voice cracked like he'd swallowed something bitter. He set down his coffee mug with the precision of a man trying to control his temper. Emma, you have a full scholarship to Penn State. You're pre-law. You're supposed to start the internship at the firm next month. I stood in the center of our family room, surrounded by 3 generations of Miller family success. Great-grandfather's CPA certificate from 1952, framed and hung beside the fireplace. Grandfather's business expansion photos from the 1970s, showing him cutting the ribbon on the second Miller and Associates location. Dad's Wall Street Journal feature from 2015, small-town accounting firm makes big impact, prominently displayed on the bookshelf. Every surface told the story of a family that built something lasting, something respectable, something that served their community while providing a comfortable life for their children and grandchildren. The American dream, Pennsylvania style, measured in steady growth and stable traditions. And here I was, about to shatter it all with words I couldn't take back. I already signed the papers, Dad. The silence that followed was the kind you feel in your bones. My mother, Margaret, dropped her needlework into her lap. My brother Daniel, home from his first year at the family business, looked up from his laptop where he'd been reviewing client files. Even the grandfather clock seemed to tick louder, marking time in a moment that would define the next 4 years of our family's life. You signed papers. Dad's voice was flat, dangerous. Without discussing it with us. Without considering your responsibilities. It's my life, Dad. No, Emma, it's not just your life. He stood up, all 6 feet 2 inches of controlled fury. It's the life your mother and I have invested everything in. It's the education we've saved for since you were 5 years old. It's the business that's been waiting for you to graduate so we can finally make it Miller and Associates and daughter. The nameplate. I'd forgotten about the nameplate. He walked to his desk and pulled out the brass plate I'd seen him working on years earlier. Harold Miller, CPA. Daniel Miller, CPA. Emma Miller, JD, CPA. The letters gleamed under the lamplight, each one representing hours of planning, years of expectation, decades of family legacy. I had this made 3 years ago, he said quietly, when you scored 1580 on your SATs. When Professor Richardson said you had the finest legal mind he'd seen in 20 years of teaching. When you won the state ethics competition. He set the nameplate on the coffee table between us. This represents everything we've built, everything we've dreamed of building. I stared at that piece of brass and felt my resolve waver. The weight of their expectations pressed down like a physical force. Here was proof of their love, their faith in my potential, their desire to include me in something bigger than myself. How could I explain that I wanted something different? How could I make them understand that their dream felt like a cage, however beautifully gilded? Dad, I appreciate everything you've done, but I need to find my own path. Your own path? Daniel finally spoke up, his voice carrying the particular irritation of an older brother who'd followed the family plan without question. Emma, you're 21 years old. You don't know what you want. This military thing is just rebellion disguised as patriotism. It's not rebellion, Danny. Then what is it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're throwing away every advantage you've ever been given for what? The chance to take orders from people who aren't as smart as you? The opportunity to risk your life for strangers who'll never know your name? The questions hung in the air like accusations. And the terrible thing was, I couldn't answer them honestly. Not completely. Because the truth was, I'd been recruited. It had started 6 months earlier, during my junior year at Penn State. I'd been researching a paper on international maritime law when I'd noticed patterns in shipping data that didn't make sense. Routes that were circuitous without clear economic justification. Cargo manifests that seemed inconsistent with declared destinations. Timeline discrepancies that suggested coordination between companies that claimed no relationship. Most people would have dismissed these anomalies as clerical errors or incomplete data. But I'd grown up in an accounting family. I knew the difference between honest mistakes and intentional obfuscation. These patterns screamed cover-up. On a whim, I'd written to the Department of Commerce, outlining my findings and asking if they were aware of these irregularities. I'd expected a form letter response, if anything. Instead, I'd gotten a phone call from a woman who identified herself as Deputy Assistant Director Catherine Chen from an agency she declined to name. She'd asked if I'd be willing to meet for coffee to discuss my interesting observations about maritime commerce. The coffee meeting had turned into a 3-hour conversation that changed the trajectory of my life. Director Chen had listened to my analysis with the attention of someone who understood exactly what I was describing. She'd asked probing questions about my methodology, my background, my interests. And at the end, she'd made an offer that sounded like something from a spy novel. We have a program, she'd said carefully, for people who see patterns others miss, people who ask the right questions, people who might be interested in serving their country in ways that don't appear in recruitment brochures. She'd slid a business card across the table. No agency name, just a phone number and her name. If you're interested in learning more, call me. But Emma? This conversation never happened. And this opportunity won't wait long. The next 3 months had been a blur of background checks, psychological evaluations, and interviews with people whose titles were classified, and whose questions revealed the existence of a world I'd never imagined. A world where recent college graduates with the right combination of intelligence, discretion, and moral flexibility could find themselves fast-tracked into positions of responsibility that traditionally took decades to achieve. They'd offered me a path to lieutenant commander within 5 years, a track to admiral before I was 30, access to operations that would let me use my analytical skills to protect American interests in ways that mattered on a global scale. But it came with a price. I couldn't tell anyone about it. Not my family, not my friends, not anyone who wasn't specifically cleared to know. To the outside world, I'd simply be another naval officer, working my way up through traditional channels. So when my family asked why I was throwing away my future for the military, I couldn't explain that I wasn't throwing it away. I was accelerating it in directions they couldn't imagine. Emma, my mother's voice was soft, pleading. Help us understand. What aren't you telling us? The question was a knife to the heart because it was so perceptive. Mom had always been able to read me better than anyone. She knew there was more to the story, but she also knew I wasn't going to share it. I can't tell you everything, Mom, but I can tell you that this isn't about running away from responsibility. It's about accepting a different kind of responsibility. What kind? Dad demanded. What responsibility could be more important than family, than the business we've built, than the community that supported us? I looked around the room one more time, memorizing the details. The family photos on the mantle, showing 3 generations of Millers at graduations, weddings, business celebrations. The comfortable furniture that spoke of stability and success, earned through hard work and conservative values. The books on the shelves, mostly business and local history, representing a worldview where problems were solved through careful planning and ethical practice. It was a good life, a respectable life, a life that thousands of people would be grateful to inherit. But it wasn't my life. I can't explain it in a way that will make sense to you, I said finally. But I need you to trust that I'm not making this decision lightly, and I need you to trust that I'm not abandoning our family values. I'm applying them in a different context. Trust. Dad repeated the word like it tasted bitter. Emma, trust is built on honesty. And you're asking us to trust a decision you won't explain, made without consulting the people who love you most. Because I can't explain it. The words came out sharper than I'd intended, carrying a frustration that had been building for months. The impossibility of bridging 2 worlds that couldn't acknowledge each other's existence. The loneliness of carrying secrets that isolated me from the people I loved most. I can't explain it, I repeated more quietly. And I know how that sounds. I know it looks like I'm being reckless or rebellious or ungrateful. But I'm asking you to trust me anyway. To trust that the daughter you raised to value integrity and service is making a decision based on those values, even if I can't share the details. Daniel laughed, but there was no humor in it. You're asking us to trust you to destroy your future based on information you won't share. Emma, that's not trust. That's blind faith. And frankly, you haven't earned that level of faith by keeping secrets and making unilateral decisions. The accusation stung because it contained enough truth to hurt. I had been keeping secrets, I was making unilateral decisions, but I was doing it in service of something larger than myself, something that required exactly the kind of sacrifice my family couldn't understand. Danny, you don't. No, Emma, I don't understand. Because you won't let me understand. You show up here with a fait accompli, and expect us to smile and support you while you flush away every advantage you've ever been given. It's not flushing anything away. Then what is it? Mom asked quietly. Because from our perspective, you're walking away from law school, from the family business, from a clear path to success and stability. You're choosing uncertainty over security, secrets over honesty, distance over closeness. Help us see what you see. I opened my mouth to try again, then closed it. Because the truth was, I couldn't help them see what I saw. The briefings were classified. The opportunities were classified. The reasons for my excitement and commitment were locked behind security clearances they couldn't obtain and wouldn't want if they could. All I could offer them was the same thing I'd been offering for months. Trust me. And it wasn't enough. The scholarship, Dad said suddenly. You'll have to pay it back. The full amount. 4 years of tuition, room, board, books. We're talking about nearly $200,000, Emma. I hadn't thought about that. Or rather, I'd pushed it to the back of my mind, because the financial reality was overwhelming. But Director Chen had mentioned that there were programs to help with educational debt for people entering certain types of government service. Details to be discussed after commitment, of course. I'll figure it out. You'll figure it out. Dad's voice rose for the first time. Emma, you're talking about starting your adult life with crippling debt, no clear career prospects beyond basic military service, and no support system because you've alienated the people who care about you most. I haven't alienated anyone. You're the ones who... Who what? Who expected you to honor your commitments? Who planned our business expansion around your participation? Who saved money for your education instead of taking vacations or upgrading our house? The guilt hit like a physical blow. Because he was right. They had sacrificed for my education. They had built their business plans around my eventual participation. They had every right to expect some consideration before I demolished their expectations. But I also had every right to choose my own life. Dad, I know you've sacrificed. I know you've planned. And I'm grateful. But those sacrifices and plans were made without asking what I wanted. Because you never said you wanted anything different, Daniel exploded. Emma, you've been talking about joining the family business since you were 12 years old. You've been saying you wanted to study law, wanted to help Dad expand into estate planning and corporate work. This military thing came out of nowhere. That wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely false either. I had talked about joining the family business because it was expected, because it seemed like a natural path, because I'd never imagined alternatives existed. The Navy recruitment had opened my eyes to possibilities I'd never considered. Maybe I didn't know what I wanted until I found it, I said quietly. Or maybe you're confusing momentary excitement with life direction, Mom suggested gently. Sweetheart, big decisions should be made carefully, with input from people who know you best. This feels so sudden, so unlike you, unlike me. The words resonated in ways my mother couldn't know. Because the person they thought they knew, steady, predictable, family-oriented Emma, was indeed unlike the person I was discovering myself to be. The recruitment process had revealed aspects of my personality I'd never recognized. A hunger for challenge, a tolerance for risk, a desire to test myself against standards higher than anything I'd previously encountered. The Emma who'd grown up in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, might have been content with the family business and small-town success. But the Emma who'd caught the attention of government recruiters was someone different. Someone who saw patterns others missed. Someone who asked questions others avoided. Someone who was willing to sacrifice personal comfort for national security. The problem was, I couldn't explain this transformation without explaining the circumstances that had triggered it. And those circumstances were classified at levels that made discussion impossible. I know it seems sudden, I said carefully, but I've been thinking about this for months, and I've gotten advice from people who understand the opportunities available. What people? Dad demanded. What opportunities? Emma, if you're making this decision based on conversations with military recruiters, you need to understand that their job is to sell you on enlistment. They're not objective advisors. If only he knew that the recruiters who'd approached me held security clearances that made them privy to global intelligence most senators never saw. That the opportunities they'd described involved responsibilities that could affect the safety of millions of Americans. That the advice I'd received came from people whose judgment was trusted by the highest levels of government. But I couldn't say any of that. I've done my research, Dad. I understand what I'm getting into. Do you? Daniel challenged. Because research and reality are different things. Have you talked to actual military personnel about what day-to-day service is like? Have you considered what it means to give up control over where you live, what you do, how you spend your time? Actually, I had talked to actual military personnel. But they'd been admirals and generals discussing strategic operations rather than enlisted personnel, complaining about mess hall food and early morning formations. My perspective on military service had been shaped by conversations about geopolitical implications rather than barracks life and military bureaucracy. But again, I couldn't explain that without revealing information I wasn't authorized to share. I've talked to enough people to make an informed decision. Informed. Dad shook his head. Emma, an informed decision requires complete information. And you're clearly not sharing complete information with us, which suggests you don't have complete information yourself. The circular logic was maddening because it was unassailable. How could I prove I was making a good decision without sharing the factors that made it good? How could I demonstrate the value of classified opportunities without declassifying them? How could I bridge the gap between their world and mine when that gap was maintained by federal law? I need you to trust me, I said again, knowing it was inadequate but having no alternative. Emma. Mom's voice was patient, loving, but firm. Trust is a two-way street. You're asking us to trust your judgment while refusing to trust us with your reasoning. You're asking for our support while withholding the information that might make support possible. Because I can't share that information. Can't or won't. Daniel pressed. Can't. Why not? The questions were closing in like a trap. Because the only honest answer was, because it's classified, and sharing it would be a federal crime. But saying that would reveal more than I was authorized to reveal and raise questions I couldn't answer. Because it's complicated. Complicated. Dad's patience was clearly exhausted. Emma, you're 21 years old. Nothing in your life is so complicated that it can't be discussed with your family. Unless you're involved in something you shouldn't be involved in. The irony was crushing. I was involved in something I absolutely should be involved in. Something that represented the highest form of public service. Something that would let me contribute to national security in ways that mattered. But it was also something that required a level of secrecy that made it look suspicious to people who lived in a world of transparent business dealings and community accountability. I'm not involved in anything inappropriate, Dad. I'm involved in something important. Important to whom? To the country. Emma, every military recruiter says that. Every sales pitch includes appeals to patriotism and service. But patriotism doesn't pay student loans. Service doesn't support a family. Importance doesn't guarantee career advancement or financial security. He was hitting every practical concern that had kept me awake during the decision-making process. Because he was right. I was choosing uncertainty over security, commitment over flexibility, service over profit. By conventional measures, I was making a terrible decision. But conventional measures didn't account for the opportunity to use my skills in ways that could prevent wars rather than profit from them. They didn't factor in the chance to work at levels of government where individual decisions could affect millions of lives. They didn't consider the possibility that some forms of success couldn't be measured in quarterly reports or annual salaries. Not everything valuable can be quantified, Dad. No, but everything consequential can be evaluated. And you're asking us to accept consequences without evaluation, based on your individual assessment of classified information we're not allowed to verify. When he put it that way, my position sounded almost absurd. I was asking my family to support a decision that would disrupt their business plans, disappoint their expectations, and separate me from them for years at a time, all based on information I couldn't share about opportunities I couldn't describe. From their perspective, I was choosing secrets over family, strangers over loved ones, uncertainty over stability, and I couldn't explain why those choices made sense without violating the very oaths that made them necessary. I'm asking you to trust that I'm still the daughter you raised, that I still value the things you taught me, and that I'm applying those values in a context you can't see, but that's worthy of them. The silence stretched long enough for the grandfather clock to chime 9 times. 9 o'clock on the last evening when we'd all be in the same room as family members who understood each other. Emma, Mom said finally, if you do this, if you leave for the military, things will change between us. Not because we don't love you, but because we won't understand your life anymore. We won't be able to share your experiences or support you in the ways parents should support their children. I know. And if something happens to you, if you're hurt or killed in service, we'll never forgive ourselves for not fighting harder to keep you safe. I understand that risk, Mom. Do you understand the risk to us? To this family? Emma, you're not just choosing a career path. You're choosing to become a stranger to the people who love you most. The weight of that truth settled over me like a burial shroud. Because she was right. The path I was choosing would transform me in ways that would make me increasingly foreign to them. The experiences I'd have, the responsibilities I'd carry, the secrets I'd keep, all of it would create distance that might never be bridged. But the alternative was to remain someone I was no longer sure I wanted to be. I'm sorry, I said quietly. I'm sorry it has to be this way, but I can't live your dreams for me. I have to find my own. Dad stood up slowly, like he'd aged a decade in the last hour. He picked up the brass nameplate and looked at it for a long moment before placing it back in his desk drawer. Then I guess that's your choice, Emma. But understand, this isn't just about you anymore. Daniel's been planning to expand the business based on your participation. We've turned down opportunities because we thought we'd have additional legal expertise in-house. Your decisions affect more than just your own life. I know, Dad, and I'm sorry for the complications. But I can't live my life to make other people's plans work. No, he said quietly. You can't. But you also can't expect other people to adjust their plans to accommodate decisions you make without consulting them. The implication was clear. If I chose the Navy over the family business, I was choosing to step outside the family's mutual support system. They wouldn't disown me, but they wouldn't organize their lives around my needs anymore either. It was a fair boundary, even if it hurt. I understand. Do you? Daniel asked. Because I don't think you understand what you're giving up. Emma, we've been planning to make you a partner by the time you're 28. Full equity stake, profit sharing, eventual succession planning. You're walking away from guaranteed financial security for the uncertainty of military service. I'm walking away from guaranteed predictability for the opportunity to find out what I'm capable of. What if you're capable of less than you think? What if this military experiment doesn't work out? What if you wash out of training, or get injured, or simply discover that service isn't as meaningful as you expected? Those were the questions that terrified me because they were legitimate. I was betting my entire future on assessments of my capabilities that might be wrong, opportunities that might not materialize, and a sense of purpose that might not survive contact with military reality. But I was also betting on myself in a way I'd never done before. And for the first time in my life, that felt more important than security. Then I'll figure something else out. Without our safety net, Dad pointed out. Emma, if you make this choice, you're choosing independence. Complete independence. We'll love you, but we won't be able to catch you if you fall. It was the final boundary, drawn with the clarity of a man who understood the difference between supporting family members and enabling poor decisions. If I chose the Navy, I'd be choosing to live with the consequences of that choice without the cushion of family resources or connections. Ironically, it was exactly the kind of stakes that made the decision feel real in a way it hadn't before. I understand, Dad, and I accept those terms. He nodded slowly. Then I guess we understand each other. But we didn't understand each other. We'd reached an accommodation that allowed us to maintain the fiction of family unity, while acknowledging fundamental disagreement about my future. It was a ceasefire, not a peace treaty, and over the next 4 years that ceasefire would gradually deteriorate into the Cold War that had led to my exclusion from my own mother's funeral. Because understanding requires communication, and communication requires honesty, and I'd chosen a path that made honesty impossible. But as I stood in that living room, surrounded by 3 generations of Miller family success, I realized that some choices are bigger than family harmony. Some opportunities are worth the risk of becoming a stranger to the people who think they know you best. I just hadn't realized how much it would cost all of us. 4 years later, I stood in my admiral's quarters aboard the USS Leviathan, staring at my reflection in the polished mirror. The woman looking back at me bore little resemblance to the 21-year-old who'd walked out of that Millbrook living room. Admiral Emma Miller. At 25, I was the youngest flag officer in modern Navy history, commanding the most classified counter-terrorism unit in the American military. The operations I'd overseen had prevented 3 major terrorist attacks, disrupted 2 international arms trafficking networks, and saved an estimated 47,000 civilian lives across 6 countries, none of which my family knew. To them, I was still Emma, the disappointment. Emma, who'd thrown away her potential for a government job they couldn't understand. The irony was suffocating. While they'd spent 4 years mourning the daughter who'd failed to launch, I'd been launching operations that required presidential authorization. The distance had grown systematically, measured in missed holidays and abbreviated phone calls. Christmas 2020. Can't make it home. Deployment extended. Daniel's wedding, 2022. Wish I could be there. Each absence had been necessary, justified by operations that saved lives. But each absence had also been another nail in the coffin of our family relationships. The last real conversation with my mother was 6 months ago, when she'd called about the cancer diagnosis. Emma, sweetheart, I wanted you to hear this from me. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 3. I'd been in a Pentagon briefing room, reviewing intelligence on planned attacks against American contractors. The juxtaposition was surreal. My mother's frightened voice while satellite photos of terrorist training camps glowed on the screen. Mom, what's the prognosis? I'll see what I can arrange for leave. Don't make promises you can't keep, sweetheart. I understand your work is classified, but I'm scared, Emma, and I miss my daughter. I'd managed a 3-day leave 2 weeks later, but the visit had been stilted, filled with conversations about safe topics while the elephant of my real life loomed over every interaction. Mom had been optimistic about treatment. Dad was cordial, but distant. Daniel avoided me entirely. That was 6 months ago, the last time I'd seen my mother alive. Since then, I'd been tracking her condition through sources I couldn't acknowledge. Medical records accessed through intelligence channels, conversations monitored through security protocols. The cancer had metastasized faster than expected. She'd died last Tuesday while I was briefing senators on counter-terrorism strategy. Daniel's phone call had been brutal in its simplicity. Emma? Mom died this morning. Peacefully. Thursday funeral, 2 o'clock. But Emma, this is going to be hard for Dad. Your absence over the last few years has been difficult to explain. The criticism was clear. My failure to be present had created complications for the family members who'd remained visible. They'd had to explain why the youngest Miller child seemed to have disappeared. I understand it's been difficult. But Danny, I've been doing important work. Important to whom, Emma? Mom spent her last months asking about you, wondering why you couldn't visit more often, trying to understand what kind of job keeps someone away from their dying mother. The accusation landed exactly where it was intended. Whatever global importance my work carried, it hadn't been important to the one person whose opinion should have mattered most. Danny, you don't understand the nature of my work. I understand that you've chosen work over family repeatedly for 4 years. I understand that Mom died wondering if her youngest daughter cared more about strangers than about the people who raised her. How could I explain that my absence from family events had coincided with operations that saved thousands of lives? That the strangers I'd prioritized included American civilians whose safety depended on my analysis? The conversation had continued for another 10 minutes, each exchange layering guilt over 4 years of accumulated misunderstanding. By the end, the message was clear. My presence would be disruptive to a grieving family's need for closure. Family only, Emma. People who've been present. People who've been part of Mom's life during her final years. But sitting in my quarters, surrounded by evidence of a life they'd never comprehended, I realized that their ignorance was a choice I'd made on their behalf. I'd protected them from understanding that their daughter carried responsibilities that could affect global stability. I'd shielded them from knowing that her decisions could mean the difference between peace and international crisis. The protection had been well-intentioned, but ultimately destructive. By keeping them ignorant of my real life, I'd forced them to construct explanations that made me seem selfish and uncaring. They'd filled the gaps with assumptions that painted me as the worst possible version of myself. But Thursday morning, that was going to change. The operational plan I'd developed was audacious and potentially career-ending. 8 Navy SEALs from my command would accompany me to Millbrook, wearing dress blues and carrying orders that authorized their presence at a civilian funeral. We would arrive precisely 15 minutes after the service began, when the chapel would be full and my family would have no choice but to witness the truth. Commander Rodriguez had coordinated the logistics with military precision. Transportation via Navy aircraft to a private airfield. Ground transport in official vehicles. Timing calibrated to maximize impact while minimizing disruption. The 8 SEALs were all volunteers from operations I'd commanded, men whose lives had been shaped by decisions I'd made during combat. Petty Officer Martinez, who'd survived an IED explosion because I'd redirected his patrol route based on intercepted communications. Chief Ramirez, who'd successfully extracted hostages because I'd provided intelligence that revealed the captor's location. Each had volunteered not because of military obligation, but because they understood the personal cost of serving at classification levels that made family relationships impossible. Admiral, Chief Ramirez had said when I'd briefed them, my family doesn't understand what I do either, but they've never doubted that it matters. Your family deserves to know that your service matters too. Thursday morning arrived gray and cold. The Navy aircraft touched down at Butler Regional Airport at 11:30 a.m. The drive to Millbrook took 22 minutes. Long enough for me to review the intelligence briefing that had arrived that morning. 3 terrorist cells disrupted. 2 arms shipments intercepted. Another day's work in a job that never paused for personal considerations. But today, personal considerations were taking precedence. Millbrook Memorial Chapel sat on the edge of town, surrounded by oak trees older than the community itself. Cars lined the street for 3 blocks, representing a turnout that spoke to the respect my mother had earned through decades of community involvement. Margaret Miller had touched lives in measurable, visible ways. the accounting firm's clients, the church committees, the charity drives. She'd been a pillar of her community in ways that were immediately comprehensible, the opposite of her youngest daughter, whose contributions were classified and invisible. The official vehicles pulled up at 2:17 p.m., precisely as planned. The 8 SEALs exited first, forming an honor guard that drew immediate attention. Their presence was unmistakably military, unmistakably elite, unmistakably purposeful. I emerged wearing full dress blues with decorations that caught the afternoon light. The Navy Cross stood out prominently, followed by the Purple Heart, the Defense Distinguished Service Medal, and 6 other commendations that most Navy officers never earned in full careers. The crowd outside fell silent, recognizing something significant but uncertain what it meant. Through the windows, I could see the service in progress, my father at the front pew with Daniel and Sarah, surrounded by relatives and friends. Chief Ramirez announced our presence to the ushers, who were clearly unprepared for military protocol at a civilian funeral. Within moments, word had traveled inside, causing a disruption that drew attention from the ongoing service. I walked through those doors wearing 4 years of accomplishments my family had never seen, followed by 8 of the most elite warriors in the American military, all present to honor a woman they'd never met, but whose daughter had earned their respect. The chapel fell completely silent as we processed down the center aisle, 400 people turning to stare at a formation that belonged in military ceremonies, not small-town funerals. My father's face went through expressions I'll remember forever: confusion, recognition, shock, and finally something that might have been awe. Daniel's mouth fell open, his composed demeanor cracking. Sarah gripped his arm, eyes wide with realization that everything they'd believed about Emma Miller was incomplete. We stopped at the front, the 8 SEALs taking positions around my mother's casket. Chief Ramirez nodded, and I stepped forward to address the gathering. My name is Admiral Emma Miller, United States Navy. Margaret Miller was my mother. The words carried across the silent chapel with the weight of 4 years of hidden truth. Every person was processing the disconnect between what they'd believed about Harold Miller's youngest daughter and what they were witnessing. For the past 4 years, my family has believed that I abandoned them for a military career that took me away from the people I loved most. They believed this because I was unable to share the nature of my service, the level of my responsibilities, or the reasons for my frequent absences. I looked directly at my father, seeing him struggle to reconcile the daughter he'd thought he knew with the woman wearing Admiral's stars. Margaret Miller died believing that her youngest daughter had chosen career over family, secrets over honesty, distance over love. She died without knowing that those choices were made in service of protecting the same community gathered here today. She died without understanding that every missed holiday, every abbreviated phone call, every unexplained absence was connected to operations that saved American lives and prevented terrorist attacks on American soil. The silence was profound, broken only by weeping in the back of the chapel. Mom died without knowing that her daughter had become the youngest admiral in modern Navy history. She died without knowing that I've commanded operations that prevented 3 major terrorist attacks, disrupted international arms trafficking networks, and saved an estimated 47,000 civilian lives across 6 countries. She died without knowing that the work she thought was keeping me away from family was actually protecting families like ours from threats they never knew existed. I turned to address the full gathering. Margaret Miller raised a daughter who believed in service, integrity, and sacrifice. Those values led me to accept responsibilities that required secrecy, not because I wanted to keep secrets from my family, but because protecting those secrets was part of protecting my family and every family represented in this room. The 8 SEALs stepped forward in unison, their movement precise and ceremonial. Chief Ramirez spoke on behalf of the formation. Admiral Miller has commanded our unit through operations that will remain classified for the next 30 years. We're here today because she saved our lives, protected our families, and led us through missions that preserved American security during critical moments of international crisis. We're here because Margaret Miller raised a daughter who embodies the highest traditions of military service, and because that daughter deserves to have her family know the truth about her sacrifice. One by one, the 8 SEALs approached my mother's casket and rendered crisp salutes, their tribute unmistakable in its precision and respect. The sound of their synchronized movements echoed through the chapel like a drumbeat of honor. When the ceremony concluded, I addressed my family directly. Dad, Danny, I know this doesn't erase 4 years of misunderstanding. I know it doesn't bring Mom back or give her the chance to hear this while she was alive. But I need you to know that every choice I made, every absence you couldn't understand, every secret I couldn't share, was made in service of values you taught me. I never abandoned this family. I served it in ways I couldn't explain until now. I placed a single red rose on my mother's casket, the same gesture I'd made at memorial services for fallen comrades in classified operations worldwide. But this memorial was different because it was personal, representing the civilian casualty of my military service, the mother who died without understanding her daughter's true calling. As I stepped back, my father rose from his seat. Harold Miller, the small-town accountant who'd spent 4 years believing his daughter was a disappointment, walked toward the woman wearing Admiral's stars. Emma. His voice was barely above a whisper. I don't understand everything you just said, but I understand that I was wrong about who you became. Dad, you weren't wrong about who I was. You just didn't have all the information about who I became. He looked at the decorations on my uniform, cataloging details that spoke to achievements he'd never imagined possible. The Navy Cross. Emma, that's for heroism in combat. Yes, sir. And you're 25 years old. Yes, sir. He shook his head slowly. I need to apologize. We all need to apologize. We made judgments based on incomplete information. Dad, you made reasonable assumptions based on the information available to you. The fault isn't yours for reaching logical conclusions. The fault is in a system that required me to keep secrets from the people I loved most. Daniel approached next, his expression mixing shame with amazement. Emma, Admiral? You're an actual admiral? I am. And these men? He gestured toward the SEALs. Some of the finest warriors I've ever had the privilege to command. And they came here for you. For Mom. They came here because they understand the cost of serving at classification levels that make family relationships complicated. They came here because they believe Mom deserved to be honored by people who understand the daughter she raised. The conversation continued for 20 minutes. 4 years of misunderstanding being partially repaired through halting questions and careful explanations. I couldn't share operational details, but I could share enough truth to help them understand that their assumptions about my priorities had been based on necessary deceptions rather than character flaws. The other mourners gradually approached, community members who'd known me as a child, all struggling to reconcile their memories with the military officer wearing decorations that spoke to service at the highest levels. Mrs. Patterson, my 3rd grade teacher. Emma dear, we had no idea. Your mother always said you were doing important work, but we never understood. The conversations were healing in ways I hadn't expected. Because for 4 years, I'd carried the weight of believing that my service had disappointed the people who mattered most. Learning that my mother had defended my choices, even without understanding them fully, provided absolution I hadn't known I needed. But the most meaningful conversation happened as the service concluded. My father pulled me aside, his expression carrying pride and regret. Emma, I need to tell you something your mother said before she died, something I didn't understand at the time. What was that, Dad? She said, Harold, I may not understand what Emma does, but I can see it in her eyes. Whatever she's carrying, it's important. Whatever she's sacrificing, it's for people like us. I just wish she didn't have to carry it alone. The words hit harder than any decoration ever could. They meant that my mother had understood more than I'd given her credit for. She'd seen through the necessary deceptions to the essential truth, that her daughter was serving something larger than herself. Dad, I'm sorry she had to carry that uncertainty. I'm sorry the classification requirements made it impossible to share what I was doing. No, Emma. I'm sorry we made it harder for you by not trusting what she could see. Your mother had good instincts about people. We should have listened to her instead of focusing on what we couldn't understand. The funeral concluded with arrangements for a private family gathering the following day, An opportunity to begin rebuilding relationships that had been strained by 4 years of necessary but destructive secrecy. I remained in Millbrook for 3 additional days, using emergency leave to participate in conversations that should have happened years earlier. Conversations about the nature of classified service, the challenge of maintaining family relationships while protecting national security, and the ways that love and duty sometimes conflict. Daniel and Sarah invited me to dinner, where I met my 2-year-old nephew for the first time and tried to explain why his aunt had been absent from his entire life until now. "Emma," Daniel said as we watched his son play, "I need to ask you something. Are you happy? Because from the outside, it looks incredibly lonely." The question forced me to consider something I'd avoided thinking about. Was I happy, or was I simply fulfilled in ways that had become confused with happiness? I'm proud of the work I do. I believe it matters. I know it's made a difference in ways that will never be publicly acknowledged. But you're right about the loneliness. Serving at this level requires sacrifices that most people don't understand and wouldn't be willing to make. Do you regret it? I regret the cost it's had on our family relationships. I regret that Mom died without understanding what I was doing. But I don't regret the service itself. I think I've used the skills and values you and Dad and Mom gave me in ways that have protected people who will never know my name. The conversation established a foundation for ongoing communication that acknowledged the limitations imposed by my classification level while creating space for the relationship to continue developing. The final conversation happened at Mom's grave, where the flowers from the funeral were beginning to wilt. "Emma, I've been thinking about what you said at the service. About Mom dying without knowing the truth about your work. Dad, Let me finish. I don't think that's entirely accurate. Your mother was smart. She had instincts about people that were usually right. Toward the end, she'd say things that suggested she understood more than she could articulate." "What kind of things?" "She'd say, 'Emma's carrying something heavy, Harold. Something important. I can see it when she calls, in the way she measures her words, in the way she looks tired even when she's trying to seem cheerful.' She said, 'Whatever our daughter is doing, it's bigger than what we can see.'" The revelation that my mother had intuited the weight of my responsibilities provided closure I hadn't expected. It meant the gap between us hadn't been as wide as I'd believed. "Dad, I wish I could have told her. Emma, your mother understood duty. She understood service. What she didn't understand was why you thought you had to carry those responsibilities alone. Because sharing them would have violated federal law. Not sharing the details, sharing the burden, letting us know there was a burden to share, even if we couldn't know its specifics." The conversation ended with commitments that felt sustainable. Regular communication that acknowledged emotional realities without revealing operational details. Visits home that didn't require cover stories. Honesty about the fact that my work was important and demanding, even if the specifics had to remain classified. As I prepared to return to Norfolk, I carried with me a different relationship with my family and a different understanding of how to balance service and personal connections. 6 months later, I received a package at my secure address. Inside was a brass nameplate, identical to the one my father had shown me 4 years earlier, but updated. Harold Miller, CPA. Daniel Miller, CPA. Admiral Emma Miller, USN. A note was attached in my father's handwriting. "Your mother always said there was room at the family table for whatever you chose to become. We should have trusted her instincts sooner. We're proud of you, Emma. All of you. The parts we can see and the parts we'll never understand." The nameplate sits on my desk now, beside the classified briefings that define my daily responsibilities. It serves as a reminder that service to country and love of family aren't mutually exclusive. It represents the possibility that truth can bridge even the widest gaps created by necessary secrecy. My mother died knowing that her youngest daughter was carrying something important, even if she couldn't know its specifics. She died believing that Emma's absences were connected to service rather than selfishness. She died trusting that the values she'd instilled were being applied in ways that mattered. In the end, that was enough. Love had filled the spaces that classification had created. Family bonds had proven stronger than institutional secrecy. The funeral that was supposed to mark the end of our relationship had instead marked its transformation. Emma the disappointment had been buried alongside Margaret Miller. Admiral Emma Miller had been introduced to a family that could finally see past the necessary deceptions to the essential truth. As I closed another secure briefing folder and prepared for another day of protecting American interests, I smiled at the brass nameplate that proved family love could survive even the most demanding classification requirements. Because some truths are too important to remain classified forever. Some relationships are too valuable to sacrifice for professional requirements. And some families are strong enough to love each other across gaps created by service to something larger than themselves. The circle was complete. The truth had been revealed. The family was whole again, even with its youngest member serving at classification levels that would always require some distance. Admiral Emma Miller continued her service with the knowledge that her family finally understood what Margaret Miller had always intuited. Their daughter was carrying something important, and she was carrying it with honor. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.